So today we're picking up where we left off Monday on what is social psychology and making those distinctions between social psychology's relationship with psychology versus its relationship with sociology. But before we get started, a few quick reminders and updates. Remember, there is no class Friday, and your first quiz is also due this Friday. So Friday is your day to complete those readings, finish watching those videos, and to take your first quiz. So again, don't forget to complete the reading assignment for this week, found on the week 2 module on Canvas. And also, as you all know, the lectures are now posted on Canvas and YouTube. Because of the size of the file and compressing it wasn't making the quality any better, I went ahead and linked the YouTube video through Canvas. So if you would prefer to watch it through Canvas, you can. If you would prefer to watch it on YouTube, that also works. I've even created a playlist on the YouTube channel that has the supplementary videos as well as the lectures. And again, I'm waiting on some equipment so that the audio will be better. I've figured out kind of how to get out the hum or some of the echo, but I know it's still a bit quiet, so be looking out for that. The audio quality should improve hopefully by next week. But other than that, make sure that you're checking out the video on Canvas or on the YouTube channel, which again is OSU SOC 3223. And finally, your first activity is now graded. I left 1 to 3 comments on each of your assignments, so make sure that you check out Canvas. Sometimes I will make comments on different things that you submit, so keep an eye out for that. All right. So as I was kind of thinking about different quotes that maybe we could use to get started for the second day of what is social psychology, I immediately thought of one architect named Buckminster Fuller. And he was very much interested in systems and synergy and sustainability, but he wasn't just interested in design. He was also interested in people. And so a little bit of a backstory on him is that he was going through a really dark time in his life. His young daughter had passed away, and he spent many nights taking long walks around his Chicago neighborhood. And one night he said he had an epiphany. And ever since, he wanted to dedicate his career to understanding how one person could make a difference, how a single individual could contribute to changing the world and benefit all humanity. And so again, as an architect, he was really interested in systems and synergy, and that's displayed in his work, as you can see right behind him in this picture right here. If I had a pointer, I'd point to it. But in his designs, he wanted to highlight how individual components must cooperate in order to produce a combined effect greater than the sum of their separate effects. And he said, "Never forget that you are one of a kind. If there weren't a need for you and all of your uniqueness, you wouldn't be here in the first place. And never forget that one person can make a difference. In fact, it is always because of one person that all the changes that matter come about." And this is reflective of his worldview and his view on design and architecture. Again, he was interested in, he wanted to highlight how individual components would cooperate to create this combined effect. And he knew that, yes, you have all these individual pieces coming together and cooperating to create one cohesive structure. But if you take out one of those pieces, the structure would collapse. And so he was very much interested in systems. And I think this relates a lot to our discussions about social psychology and the interplay of sociology and psychology. is understanding that yes, people are unique. Each of you is very unique and has your own goals and dreams and things that you can do and things that you can contribute to the world. But at the same time, we all come together in all of our uniqueness and we cooperate. And you can see that in subtle but often even more explicit ways. Maybe you're driving around town. You stop at a stop sign and you let someone else go before you, or you go ahead and go. Basically, the way that we keep order on the roads is because we're all cooperating. We all have these shared understandings that there are certain rules we have for driving. And that goes for social life as well. There are certain rules and expectations that we understand, and that helps us to communicate and cooperate with each other on an individual level, but also within institutions and across society. And again, this is a huge concern. This is in fact the primary concern of social psychology, whether that be the psychological side or the sociological side. It's very much interested in and emphasizes the interrelation of the mind, self, culture, social structure, and social action. And we can see all of this in the two faces of social psychology that are fundamentally sociological. But for symbolic interactionism, it's really important that you must first acknowledge its origins in pragmatism, because that's important for understanding the most basic assumptions of not only symbolic interactionism, but lots of different areas of sociology, as well as some of the other sociological face of social psychology. So again, its origins in pragmatism are very important. And so, for example, when I first started in sociology coming from psychology, I really struggled to grasp thinking or what it meant to think like a sociologist. And so I decided to, maybe it would make sense to go and look at the philosophical, those foundations of these theories of sociology, of parts of social psychology. And I found, again, pragmatism. That's what symbolic interaction is based in, and symbolic interaction very much is a big influence throughout sociology and social psychology. And so to give you a very general, broad definition, and for pragmatism, it originated kind of in contrast or a critique of idealism, which says that idealism is a philosophical tradition which suggests that the reason for thought is that it allows us to act and solve problems based on our ability to describe and understand reality. Now pay close attention, because the differences can be subtle, but I'll give you some examples. Pragmatism is a philosophical tradition which suggests that the reason for thought is that it allows us to act and solve problems based on our subjective understanding of the world. So for idealism, it claims that reality is in some way indistinguishable or inseparable from human perception and understanding. That things do exist in some reality, but we are the ones who apply categories which structure all of our experiences. In contrast, pragmatism claims that reality is in some way inseparable from agency within the mind. So again, to point out that subtlety is idealism says that reality is in some way indistinguishable from human perception. But for pragmatism, reality is in some way inseparable from the agency of the mind. So what that means is that idealists would say that yes, there is some sort of fundamental truth, some sort of fundamental reality, but we are limited by our ability to perceive that reality. We're limited by the language we use, the way we've been taught to think about things and categorize things, whereas pragmatism says that reality is our perception. Because again, the whole purpose of thought for a pragmatist is that it allows us to solve problems and act in the world based on our subjective understanding. And beyond that, it's not necessarily practical to try to get at some sort of fundamental truth. Perception is very important for pragmatism. So, for example, take, I don't know, a computer. I'm looking at a computer and, obviously I've grown up in a society where I've always been around computers. It's something it's always been a fixture in my life. Maybe it was at home or school, or it's something I'm using right now. Something I'm very familiar with, and I know quite a bit about it, but I also don't know a whole lot about computers. So when I look at this computer, I'm perceiving it as something that I can use to access the internet, I can use to complete assignments and contact others, and store videos and pictures and songs and all of that stuff. But let's say that I was someone who had never seen a computer before. I'd never seen anything like this, no technology even close to this. I might perceive it as something that's scary or dangerous, or I might not see it as being functional, having no purpose. And so again, as someone who has grown up and there's always been computers, I see it one way, but of course I'm not perceiving it entirely as it is because I don't understand the nitty-gritty of how a computer works. So my perception of it is limited by my experiences and by my ability to describe what I'm seeing. But if I'd never seen a computer before, maybe I find it, like I said, scary or useless, and I don't understand it because I would be limited by my experiences. And that's how an idealist or idealism would view that. So I'd be limited, that there is some fundamental truth to this object of what it is and its function and what it's made of, but I can only perceive so much of it. And in that case, reality is in some way inseparable from or indistinguishable from my perception. But a pragmatist or pragmatism might say that, yes, one person sees this computer as very useful. Maybe another person really understands computers and they fully understand every part of that machine. But for the person who's never seen it before and doesn't understand it and might even find it scary, it doesn't matter what the computer actually is. What matters is that this person's reality is that this object is scary. So keep that in mind as we move through this. And so again, this is a broad generalization, but if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, an idealist might say, yes, it likely made what we would call a sound. And even though no one was around to perceive it, we can assume it made some sort of disturbance, some sort of vibration, and we would probably call that a sound. But a pragmatist might say, no, because no one was there to hear it. And the purpose of our ability to perceive sounds would be to maybe keep us from harm, like a falling tree, for example. So if a tree fell in a forest and no one was around, did it make a sound? No, because sound and reality is inseparable from our agency, our ability to do something about it. So keep that in mind. Again, kind of these broad and general differences between idealism and pragmatism. And so again, pragmatism, it's looking at thought and perception. The purpose of it is so that we can navigate the world and we can do something about it. And beyond that, it's not really practical to consider some sort of fundamental truth that may or may not exist. And so from this philosophical tradition of pragmatism that led into symbolic interactionism and the development of social psychology as a whole came the Thomas theorem. The Thomas theorem says, if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Because we encounter ambiguous situations every day, many meanings are possible. The way we define each situation then becomes reality. So a few examples of the Thomas theorem that I'm sure some of you have heard before are monsters under the bed. So let's say a child believes that there is a monster under their bed. Of course, we know that that's not true, that there isn't a monster under the bed. And you could tell a kid that there's not a monster under the bed all day long. But it doesn't really make a difference because they believe there is. And whether or not that's true, it's still going to cause them to feel frightened, maybe it disturbs their sleep and they don't get adequate sleep. They're going to be waking up their parents all night if they're scared. So whether or not there's a monster under the bed, the point is that they believe that there's a monster under the bed. And that has real consequences. And so that then becomes reality by the way that that child defines the situation, which is a scary situation where there's a monster under the bed. And when we look at something like bullying, for example, it's something that, right, some people might perceive as, oh, like one kid is just, or not even children, adults even, but they might say, okay, well, this one person, the bully, like they're just playing around, they just have this kind of sense of humor, whatever the case may be. But whether or not that's the case, and it is often not, the person who's being bullied certainly perceives it as bullying. And there are very real consequences to that. And so at that point, it doesn't really matter whether or not the bully thinks that they're bullying or if other people perceive it, as long as the person who's being bullied feels that they are. Because again, that has very real consequences. And maybe even on a very low level, say you're in a situation, maybe a first date, or you've just met somebody, and one or both of you is perceiving some sort of romantic interest. Well, that has very real consequences as well, for better or for worse. So let's say, again, one person is perceiving that there's some sort of romantic interest, then that may change their behavior towards the other person. And again, those consequences are very real, regardless of whether or not there's actual interest, because this person is perceiving it to be the case. And again, that has very real consequences for better or for worse. And then we look at something like social problems. You could look at it a few different ways. One is that, right, some people believe things are social problems and others don't. We all have, different interests and things that we think are major issues right now in society, and that's important. But, right, someone might say, I don't really see that as a social problem. Well, from this perspective, whether or not you think that that is a social problem, whether or not you think that that is fundamentally true, doesn't really matter, because a lot of people do view this thing as a social problem, and that has very real consequences. And similarly, again, when you're looking at a social problem itself, and someone says like, oh, this isn't really a problem in the way you think it is. It doesn't necessarily matter, because it has very real consequences. People can feel fear. They can feel angry. Lots of different feelings and reactions to whatever the social problem is or is perceived to be. And that has very real consequences. So from this perspective, it would definitely be important to take into consideration other people's perspectives and experiences and perceptions of the world. Because from a pragmatist view, there's not necessarily this like fundamental truth, this fundamental reality. It comes down to who is perceiving it, how it's being perceived, and very much what are the consequences. The consequences are real. The problem is very much real as well. Which leads to symbolic interaction, which this is something we will cover in our next section. So starting next week, we'll go more into symbolic interactionism. But for now, I just want you to see kind of how symbolic interaction developed from pragmatism, which again says that reality is indistinct from human perception, human agency in particular. And then it went into these this philosophical basis for symbolic interactionism, which led into these three major premises, which again we'll talk more about starting next week. But for now, it's important to know that kind of at the heart of symbolic interaction is meaning. And we use what we call the definition of the situation to know what is expected of us and what is expected of others in a given situation. And through the process of social interaction, we assign meaning based on these interactions. And this meaning is not inherent in the words or gestures that we use, but it's instead created socially through the use of language, for example. And so within language, within our gestures, our language, our interactions, lies our assumptions and our understanding of reality. And again, that's very much at the heart of symbolic interactionism, is meaning making, shared meaning, shared understanding. And we develop these meanings through our interactions with others. And first, people interpret the world to themselves. And meaning is given to people and objects by the person who is perceiving them. And similarly, behavior is not an automatic reaction to given stimuli, but rather a creative construction growing out of a person's interpretation of the situation and others in it. The interpretation of situations in this case, and the construction of behavior, are processes occurring in the context of human interaction. And Herbert Blumer, one of the fathers of symbolic interactionism and a sociologist, he says, human society is made up of individuals who have selves. That individual action is a construction, being built up by the individual through interpreting features of the situation in which he acts. That group or collective action consists of the aligning of individual actions brought about by individuals interpreting each other's actions. And so again, kind of going back to that original quote in our discussion of this interplay between psychology and sociology, and then putting that in the context of symbolic interaction, we are each individuals and we interpret the world, again, unto ourselves. And then we go out and we have interactions with others. We're involved in this very complex social life. And that we're able to interpret others' actions and assign meaning to these actions and these interactions in words and gestures and phrases and ideology and so on. And so again, what's important to note here is that, as he says, group or collective action consists of the aligning of individual actions brought about by individuals interpreting each other's actions. And that's something that's very important to note. We're looking at the same thing that we originally started out talking about, how all of these unique individuals come together to create this cohesive, cooperative group, what we call society. You can even look at it on the meso level. So in different institutions would be one example, like in a neighborhood or a community or an organization and so on. And then more on a very micro level of interpersonal interactions. And that all of these things come together and align. But what it entails is all of us interpreting each other and interpreting situations and assigning meaning to, again, words and ideas and gestures and action, and then developing some sort of shared meaning among each other. So for a symbolic interactionist, social life is to understand the processes through which individuals interpret situations and construct their actions with respect to each other. And this perspective influences the other domain of sociological social psychology as well. Like symbolic interactionism, psychological sociology also focuses on more real-world concerns. But unlike symbolic interactionism, it puts greater emphasis on both macro-social structural concepts and tends to be more quantitative in their methodology. And what's important to note is that this is the part of social psychology that is considered the most fundamentally sociological. And so psychological sociology is often referred to as personality and social structure. But again, all of these are clumped together as sociological social psychology. And again, in this domain, It's more focused on macro social structures like organizations, occupations, social class, religion, community, and so on, and the processes associated with these structures, so like urbanization, industrialization, and social mobility. They look at these things and relate them to individual psychological attributes and behavior. So, we might ask ourselves, what does class have to do with, say, urbanization or suburbanization? Well, we might look at reasons why people move to a different neighborhood or a different area of the city. And do they do it to feel safer, for better schools, to be closer to their job? And there are lots of reasons for this, and we can explore those, and maybe even things that are related to these processes in these macro social structures and the processes that we're talking about here that relate to specifically urbanization and suburbanization. So when we're looking at why people might move to a different area or a different neighborhood, how does class come into play there? If we look across, let's say, different class categories, what are their reasons? What's their decision-making process look like? Why do they move from one neighborhood to another? So again, is it maybe because they want to live in a safer area, maybe an area where there's more parks, better schools, closer to their job, closer to grocery stores, restaurants, maybe family? There's lots of different things coming into play here. And so again, we're looking at those macro social structures like class and the related processes like urbanization and suburbanization. And we would then look across these class groups and say, why did you move to the suburbs? And we would want to get more into that. And what are the reasons? What's the reasoning across these different class categories? And here are some other research examples in this area. All of these, I would say, are fairly prominent research examples, again, in the area of personality and social structure. So the first being the impact of social class on self-image, personality, and values. Another being the reciprocal relation of modernization to individual personality and behavior. And then the Fisher study explored the effects of urban residents on individual personality and behavior. And that kind of gets into this area of research called neighborhood effects, which we will touch on a little bit throughout the semester. And then Sewell and Hauser looked at the role of individual motivation in the status attainment process, which that's something that we will cover later in the semester. That'll be a different section towards the end. And then another study looked at the relation between personality and the performance of organizational roles. So again, though, it's very important to recognize that when we talk about maybe personality or different psychological characteristics or personality characteristics, they're not necessarily defining personality in the same way that psychology would define personality. And one thing, again, that I struggled with coming from psychology into sociology is I was recognizing some of these theories that I learned about in psychology. And I was like, but this is not what it was saying. This is not really accurate. But once I looked more into it and read about the history and kind of what inspired each of these individuals to venture into this kind of growing discipline called social psychology, is that they were very much inspired by a lot of the things that were happening in psychology at the time. And so they took inspiration from a lot of psychological concepts and theories and applied them to their own work in various ways. But again, they weren't interpreting these things as psychologists. They were interpreting them as sociologists. So while there are a lot of similarities, they were being filtered through this very specific sociological lens. So keep that in mind as you start to maybe recognize some similarities and differences in concepts and theories as we move through the semester. And so because social psychology, in this area in particular, was so isolated from psychology, it over time grew to focus more on sociological aspects. and more so sees the psychological aspects, like I said, through a sociological lens, especially coming from psychology. Again, you'll see that it's clear a lot of the psychological aspects have been interpreted and applied by people who are not socialized into the discipline of sociology, or psychology. They were not socialized into the discipline of psychology, so they're filtering it through the lens of sociology. And so that is not to say that its interpretation and application are necessarily wrong, but it's important to be aware that these are concepts from psychology that were interpreted a bit differently. They were used to inspire a lot of really good and exciting new ideas at the time in the field of social psychology, particularly in this area. And it did emerge as a critique of both behaviorism and sociologism. But essentially, the big popular thing at the time in psychology was behaviorism, and they said that social life cannot be adequately understood in terms of stimulus response, involving little cognition or cognitive mediation. So again, like we discussed earlier, behavior is not a simple stimulus and response, where you have this conditioned response that you'll provide every time. There's a lot of cognition happening. There's a lot of defining the situation, right? You have to define the situation. You have to interpret the meaning of gestures and words and the context. And that tells you then how to respond appropriately. And it also came as a critique of sociologism that says that social life cannot be understood without taking into account the intentions, needs, or beliefs of individuals. So it was like, okay, what's going on in sociology right now is totally discounting individuals and individual intentions, individual needs, individual beliefs. And so it tried to kind of create this happy medium between it isn't a simple stimulus-response relationship. There is a lot of decision-making and interpreting and understanding meaning that's happening. And that while this is something that is socialized as part of, as being a member of society, there's also a lot of individual uniqueness to this process. And some of the central concerns of this area in particular are how social structures come to influence individual personality. Another central concern is how personality and social structure combine to determine socially consequential behaviors. And finally, how the fit between individual needs or abilities and structural demands affects individual social functioning. And so looking at these three central concerns of what we would call sociological psychology, which again, it's typically all just called sociological social psychology. These are the three main concerns. So in symbolic interactionism, they're very much concerned with face-to-face interactions, very real-world experiences, understanding how people assign meaning to things, how do they interact with things based off of this meaning-making process, how do people create shared meaning, and so on and so forth. Whereas here, there's very much an emphasis on social structure and how does that come to influence individuals in their personality, so to speak, or rather maybe their decision-making process, their intentions, their needs and values, and so on. And then, of course, looking at how personality and social structure combine to determine these socially consequential behaviors. And as we move through the semester, we will discuss some of these major studies in this area and give you more concrete examples as to what this means. By what do we mean by personality and what do we mean by social structure, and how in the world do those two things combine to create certain behaviors. And that's not even necessarily individual behavior, but going back to what Herbert Bloomer said is how individuals, their perspectives and understanding can align to create a more cohesive group and maybe even collective action. And then finally, how the fit between individual needs or abilities and structural demands affects individual social functioning. I would say this one is a very big area of this particular phase of social psychology, is understanding those individual needs and abilities, what people have, what people need, and their position in society, in the social structure, whether that be on the macro level, like in society, or in more on the meso level. So maybe in a neighborhood, community, or in a school even. And we would look at how their needs and their abilities interact with their place and their position in the social structure, within a school, within an institution, within society as a whole, and sometimes maybe even within a family. But predominantly, it's very much focused on these more macro social structures. And so I hope that gave you all a really good overview of social psychology, kind of some of the differences that you'll see, and understand that the two phases of sociological social psychology, being social symbolic interactionism and sociological psychology, how they differ from the psychological variant, and kind of things to kind of prime you for the rest of the semester so that you can understand the foundation of these theories and practice and what has driven these different research endeavors throughout the history of social psychology. But before we end, just a quick reminder, don't forget to complete your readings, watch the supplementary videos, and submit assignments for this week. And next week, we'll be diving into more of the nitty-gritty of symbolic interactionism.